The first-class cabin of Flight 287 was bathed in golden light, the gentle hum of the engines creating a calm atmosphere. Expensive leather seats, freshly poured champagne, and the quiet rustling of newspapers set the tone for what should have been a peaceful journey. Michael Carter settled into his seat, adjusting the cuffs of his crisp navy blue suit. He wasn't just another passenger. His presence commanded respect, a man of discipline, confidence, and quiet authority. But then, Richard Holloway entered the cabin, a well-dressed, middle-aged businessman, his watch alone worth more than an average person's salary. He walked in with the air of someone who believed he owned the world, or at least this flight. As he reached his assigned seat, his gaze landed on Michael, and his expression shifted. His confident stride slowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, he looked as if he had entered the wrong section of the plane. His eyes darted to Michael's seat number, then back to the boarding pass in his hand. Michael didn't react. He had encountered that look before, the unspoken question, "What is someone like you doing here?" Richard hesitated, then turned to the nearest flight attendant, his voice dripping with forced politeness. "Excuse me, are you sure this is correct?" he asked, motioning toward Michael. The flight attendant blinked. "I'm sorry, sir." Richard leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to sound discreet, but loud enough for Michael to hear. "I believe there may be a mistake. I paid for business class. Shouldn't people like him be seated elsewhere?" The cabin went silent. Michael didn't move. He simply folded his hands in his lap, his expression unreadable. The flight attendant stiffened. "Sir, every passenger here is in their assigned seat." Richard let out a short humorless laugh. "Right, of course, just checking." But the way he said it made it clear he wasn't convinced. He finally lowered himself into the seat beside Michael, but deliberately turned his body away, as if sharing armrest space was beneath him. Michael sighed quietly. It was going to be a long flight. The aircraft had barely reached cruising altitude when Richard Holloway made his next move. Michael had ignored the earlier tension, choosing to focus on his book, an old but well-worn copy of The Art of War. But Richard, he wasn't done yet. A flight attendant approached, offering drinks. Michael calmly requested a glass of water. Richard, with an air of entitlement, ordered champagne. As the drinks were placed on their trays, Richard suddenly shifted in his seat, too forcefully. The movement sent his glass tilting toward Michael. Splash. Cold liquid soaked into the sleeve of Michael's tailored suit. A few drops even landed on the open pages of his book. For the first time, Michael looked directly at Richard. His gaze was sharp, calculated. Richard feigned surprise. "Oh dear, how clumsy of me." His smirk betrayed his words. A murmur passed through the nearby passengers. Some turned to watch. Michael exhaled slowly, brushing the droplets off his sleeve. No reaction, no words. But that wasn't enough for Richard. He leaned back in his seat, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know, I always thought they had a dress code for business class. Guess I was wrong." Michael remained silent, but others were listening now. An older woman across the aisle narrowed her eyes. A young couple exchanged uneasy glances. Even the flight attendant, who had just returned, froze in place. Michael finally spoke, his voice smooth and even. "If you spill another drink on me, I'll assume you need a new seat." His tone wasn't angry, it wasn't even loud, but something about the way he said it made the air in the cabin shift. Richard's smirk faltered. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but he recovered quickly, letting out a fake laugh. "Relax, buddy. It was just an accident." Michael turned back to his book, his expression unreadable, but inside, he knew one thing. This wasn't over. The tension in the first-class cabin had turned thick, almost tangible. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stole glances, pretending to read or watch their in-flight entertainment, but their focus was elsewhere, on Michael and Richard. Michael had remained composed, unshaken. His eyes traced the words in his book, but he wasn't reading. He was waiting, because he knew men like Richard Holloway. They never stopped at one insult, and he was right. Richard let out a dramatic sigh, stretching his legs, as if the mere presence of Michael beside him was an inconvenience. Then he did something bold. He pressed the flight attendant button. Within seconds, a young woman in uniform appeared, her professional smile still in place, but her eyes wary. She already knew something was off. "Yes, sir, how can I assist you?" Richard put on his most charming, entitled expression. "Listen, I don't want to make a big deal, but I was wondering if there's another seat available." The flight attendant frowned. "Is there a problem, sir?" Richard's smile was thin, his tone deliberately casual. "It's just I paid for first class, because I value comfort, and well," he gestured vaguely toward Michael, without looking at him. "I'd just prefer to sit somewhere else, maybe next to someone I'd actually enjoy talking to." The entire row fell silent. Michael slowly closed his book. Passengers were now fully watching. The older woman across the aisle pursed her lips, disgusted. The young couple 2 rows ahead subtly shook their heads. Even the businessman 3 seats away, who had been glued to his laptop, finally looked up. The flight attendant blinked, processing Richard's request. Then in a sharp but polite tone, she said, "I'm sorry, sir. All first-class seats are assigned. If you'd like, I can move you to economy." A snort of laughter came from someone in the back. Richard's face twitched. That wasn't the answer he had expected. His fake smile vanished. His entitlement cracked. "That won't be necessary," he muttered. The flight attendant turned to Michael, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "Sir, can I get you anything?" Michael met her gaze, offering the smallest nod. "I'm fine, thank you." The moment stretched a little too long before she finally walked away. But Richard, he was still seething, and then, as if needing to salvage his pride, he let out a loud chuckle, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. First class isn't what it used to be." Michael tilted his head slightly, his patience wearing thin. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, measured, but it carried weight. "It's exactly what it used to be, Richard. You're just not used to being treated like everyone else." Richard's face turned red. Passengers whispered, and that's when Richard did something he'd regret. He pressed the flight attendant button, again, and this time, when the same young woman returned, he dropped the act. "I want the captain, now." The entire cabin tensed. The young flight attendant hesitated. "Sir, is there?" Richard cut her off. "I don't feel safe sitting next to him." A sharp inhale rippled through the passengers. Someone audibly gasped. Michael sat back in his seat, calm, still, but behind his measured expression, something shifted, because now, it was over for Richard Holloway. The hum of the aircraft's engines was drowned out by the weight of Richard's accusation. "I don't feel safe sitting next to him." The words lingered in the air like a bad stench. For a split second, no one moved, no one spoke. Then the young flight attendant stiffened. She wasn't just dealing with an arrogant passenger anymore. This was a serious claim. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The older woman across the aisle looked outright disgusted. A businessman adjusted his glasses, shaking his head. The young couple in row 3, eyes wide, glued to the scene unfolding before them. Michael Holloway had heard it all before, and yet, something about this moment felt different. Richard wasn't just being racist now, he was playing a dangerous game. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, can you clarify? Has this passenger done something to make you feel unsafe?" Richard's smug expression returned. He leaned back, acting like a man who had already won. "I don't know, I just call it intuition. Something about him doesn't sit right with me." A thinly veiled insult, an accusation based on nothing but arrogance and ignorance. Michael watched the scene unfold with unshaken composure. He could end this right now. But no, he wanted Richard to dig his own grave first. The flight attendant turned to Michael, clearly conflicted. "Sir, do you have anything to say?" Michael exhaled slowly, then set his book down, deliberately. He leaned forward, not aggressively, not confrontationally, just enough to make Richard visibly tense, and then he reached into his inner jacket pocket. A couple of passengers leaned in, curiosity etched on their faces. Michael pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. The moment his fingers flipped it open, the entire mood of the cabin shifted, because there, glinting under the cabin lights, was his FBI badge. The gold lettering, the emblem, the authority, all unmistakable. Michael's voice was calm, steady, but impossibly sharp. "I appreciate your concern, Richard, but I assure you," he tilted the badge slightly toward him, "you're sitting next to the safest man on this plane." The gasp that followed, delicious. Richard froze, his face drained of color so fast that for a second, Michael wondered if the man would pass out. A pin-drop silence fell over the cabin, then laughter. Someone behind them let out a chuckle. The businessman in row 5 smirked and muttered, "Well, this just got interesting." Richard's lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time since boarding, he had nothing to say. Michael leaned back into his seat, expression unreadable. The flight attendant, she was struggling to hold back a smirk. "Is there anything else I can help you with, Mr. Holloway?" she asked, voice dripping with polite amusement. Richard just sat there, trapped, cornered, humiliated. Michael finally turned back to his book, unbothered, unshaken. But before he continued reading, he murmured, just loud enough for Richard to hear, "I'd suggest you get some rest. It's a long flight." And just like that, checkmate. Richard's face was a battlefield of emotions, shock, embarrassment, rage. He blinked rapidly, as if hoping the FBI badge in front of him would somehow disappear. It didn't. The passengers were still watching. A few smirks, a couple of whispers. The businessman in row 5 had fully turned in his seat, clearly enjoying the show. And then, someone clapped, just once, a single deliberate clap, then another, and another. Within seconds, a wave of applause rippled through the cabin. Michael Holloway, he didn't even acknowledge it. He simply closed his badge holder with a soft click, tucked it back inside his jacket, and turned his attention to his book, as if Richard didn't even exist. But Richard felt it. He felt the weight of every stare. The young woman across the aisle who had called him out earlier, she was grinning. The couple in row 3, whispering and shaking their heads. He wasn't the powerful one anymore. He was the joke. The flight attendant, who had been struggling to contain her amusement, took a deep breath and smoothed her skirt. "Well," she said, voice laced with professional politeness, "I trust we're all comfortable now." Michael gave a small nod. Very. Richard couldn't take it anymore. He shot up from his seat so fast that the elderly woman behind him gasped. I need a different seat," he sputtered. The flight attendant crossed her arms. "I'm sorry, sir, but this flight is full. Then I need to get off this plane." A ripple of laughter ran through the cabin. The flight attendant raised an eyebrow. "Sir, we are currently 30,000 feet in the air." Someone in the back actually wheezed. Richard's fists clenched. He was trapped. No escape, no backup. And the worst part, Michael hadn't even looked at him since flashing the badge. The indifference was more humiliating than the confrontation. Richard had lost, and for the rest of the flight, he had to sit there, silent, seething, while Michael simply turned the page. The flight landed at JFK International Airport with a smooth touchdown, but for Richard, it might as well have been a crash landing. He had spent the entire flight in complete silence. No smug remarks, no passive-aggressive comments, just stiff, mortified stillness. Michael, on the other hand, utterly unbothered. As the seatbelt sign flicked off, passengers stood up, stretched, and gathered their belongings. The cabin was buzzing with quiet chatter, but one thing was clear. Everyone still remembered what had happened. Some passengers snuck glances at Richard,
Others whispered to their seatmates, and a few, bold enough to shake Michael's hand as they passed. Respect, man, that was legendary. I wish I had recorded that. Thanks for putting that guy in his place. Michael accepted the praise with nothing more than a nod and a polite smile. Then as he reached for his carry-on, a soft voice spoke beside him. "Excuse me, Agent Holloway." Michael turned. It was the young flight attendant, the same one who had been caught in the middle of the drama earlier. Her expression was a mix of amusement and admiration. "I just wanted to say, I've seen a lot of bad passengers in my time, but that was something else." Michael chuckled. "Unfortunately, I've seen worse." She smirked. "I don't doubt that." Then with a more serious look, she added, "Thank you for handling it the way you did." Michael nodded once, shouldering his bag. "Just doing my job, even when I'm off duty." Then just as he was about to step into the aisle, a voice sharp and bitter cut through the low murmur of the cabin. "Richard, you think you're some kind of hero?" A few heads turned. The tension snapped back into place like a rubber band. Michael sighed and slowly turned around. Richard stood there, red-faced, fists clenched, his last shred of dignity barely hanging on. Michael tilted his head. "Excuse me," Richard sneered. "You think flashing a badge makes you better than me?" Michael's expression didn't change. Calm, controlled, deadly precise. "No." He took one slow step forward. "I think my actions do." Silence. Richard had nothing left to say. His mouth opened, then closed. His jaw clenched, then loosened, because he knew. Everyone knew. Michael didn't need to win the argument. He already had. With that he gave Richard one last, almost pitying look, before turning and walking off the plane. Richard, he stood there, frozen, humiliated, defeated, and as Michael stepped into the terminal, greeted by the crisp airport air and the familiar sight of travelers rushing to their gates, he let out a slow breath. Another day, another entitled man, learning a lesson he wouldn't forget. And as his phone buzzed with an incoming message from HQ, he smirked. Time to get back to work.